The Elves. Elves are the oldest and most central race in Tolkien's mythology. They were the first of the children of Ilúvatar, created by the single divine being Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of all existence. Unlike men, elves are bound to the world itself. They do not die of old age or illness, though they can be slain in battle or die from grief. Their lives are directly tied to the fate of Arda, the world in which Middle-earth exists. As long as the world endures, so do they. The history of the elves begins in the earliest period of Tolkien's legendarium, long before The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. They awoke by the shores of Cuiviénen in the far east of Middle-earth. Soon after their awakening, they were discovered by the Valar, the angelic beings who shaped the world, and were invited to come dwell with them in Valinor, the undying lands far to the west across the sea. This invitation divided the elves into two broad groups, those who accepted and those who refused. The ones who journeyed west became known as the Eldar, while those who remained behind were called the Avari, meaning the unwilling. Among the Eldar, some completed the journey across the sea and reached Valinor. These were the High Elves, the most noble and powerful of their kind. Others stopped along the way and settled in Middle-earth. These became the Sindar and Nandor, collectively known as the Grey Elves or Wood Elves. The High Elves, having lived under the light of the two trees of Valinor, possessed greater wisdom, knowledge, and beauty than any other race. Yet even among them, division arose. A faction of the High Elves, led by Fëanor, rebelled against the Valar and returned to Middle-earth to wage war against Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. This rebellion defined much of the First Age, leading to centuries of war, tragedy, and exile. Over time, most of the High Elves were destroyed or diminished, and those who survived either returned to Valinor or remained in hidden realms like Rivendell and Lothlorien. By the time of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the elves had faded from prominence. The Wood Elves of Mirkwood, ruled by Thranduil, represented the more rustic and cautious side of their kind, while the High Elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien, under Elrond and Galadriel, preserved the last remnants of their ancient power. Though they rarely interfered in the affairs of men, their wisdom and foresight continued to shape the fate of Middle-earth. The elves embody the link between language, history, and beauty in Tolkien's world. They were the original speakers of the Elvish tongues, Quenya, Sindarin, and others, which Tolkien himself invented as a philologist. In his mythology, their history served as the framework through which his languages evolved, making them the foundation of all his storytelling. The elves were not simply another race. They were the living expression of Tolkien's linguistic and mythic imagination, the Ainur. Before any of the races of Middle-earth existed, there were the Ainur, the first and greatest beings created by Eru Ilúvatar. The Ainur were divine spirits, each embodying a different aspect of Ilúvatar's thought and creativity. They existed with him before the world was made, learning and expressing his will through music. This music of the Ainur was not symbolic. It was the literal act of creation. As they sang, their harmonies formed the structure of the world, its oceans, mountains, stars, and life. Among the Ainur were two main orders, the Valar and the Maiar. The Valar were the most powerful of them, sometimes called the powers of the world. Each Vala had a domain. Manwë ruled the air and winds, Ulmo governed the seas, Aula shaped the earth and crafted its materials, Yavanna nurtured all growing things, and Melkor, the mightiest of them all, embodied fire, destruction, and discord. The Maiar were lesser spirits who served the Valar, similar to angels assisting archangels, but still immensely powerful in their own right. The creation of Arda, the world that includes Middle-earth, began when some of the Ainur chose to enter their song and inhabit the physical realm. This act transformed them from pure spirits into guardians of the world's form and destiny. Those who entered became bound to Arda and took responsibility for shaping and governing it throughout its history. Melkor, later known as Morgoth, was the first source of evil among them. During the music of the Ainur, he wove his own melodies into the song, introducing dissonance and striving to impose his own vision of creation. This rebellion planted the seeds of all corruption in Arda. When the world was formed, Melkor descended into it, seeking to claim it for himself. His pride and desire for domination would lead to endless wars with the other Valar and later with the elves and men of Middle-earth. The remaining Valar, led by Manwë, opposed him and established order where they could. They shaped continents, oceans, and skies, creating a world of beauty despite Melkor's interference. The Maiar served them as attendants and messengers. Many of these Maiar became famous under different names. Sauron, once a servant of Aule, who would later become the Dark Lord of the Second and Third Ages, and the Five Wizards, Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the two Blue Wizards, who were also Maiar, sent by the Valar in human form to guide the peoples of Middle-earth against Sauron's rising power. The Ainur are the framework of all being in Tolkien's cosmology. They exist both within and beyond time, shaping events through influence rather than direct rule. The Valar act as stewards of creation, while the Maiar interact more closely with the world's inhabitants. Even beings like Tom Bombadil and the Great Eagles trace their origins to the Ainur, representing the lingering presence of divine power within Middle-earth. Every act of courage, hope, and renewal in Tolkien's stories echoes the music of the Ainur, the song that began the world and continues through every age. Men. Men were the second race created by Ilúvatar, following the elves. Together, elves and men are known as the children of Ilúvatar, but they differ in one defining way: mortality. Whereas elves are bound to the world until its end, men are mortal. They live shorter lives and then depart from Arda entirely. Their souls pass beyond the world to a fate unknown, even to the Valar. This gift of men, as it was called, was meant to free them from the confines of the world's cycles, but over time, men came to fear death and view it as a curse rather than a gift. When men first awoke in the east of Middle-earth, Morgoth was already active in the world. Many of the earliest tribes of men were quickly deceived or dominated by him, falling under his shadow. Yet others resisted his influence and eventually became allies of the elves and the Valar. These loyal houses were called the Edain, and their faithfulness earned them a unique reward after Morgoth's defeat at the end of the First Age. The Valar raised a great island in the Western Sea and gave it to the Edain as a gift. This island was Númenor, a paradise between Middle-earth and Valinor. The people of Númenor, called Númenorians, became the most advanced and noble of all men. They were taller, wiser, and far longer lived than other human races, often living 2 to 3 centuries. They built vast cities and fleets of ships and achieved mastery over craftsmanship, learning, and governance. But with time, their hearts grew proud. The Númenorians began to envy the immortality of the elves and resent their own mortality. Their great king Ar-Pharazôn was eventually deceived by Sauron, who was brought to Númenor as a captive but soon became the king's chief advisor. Under Sauron's influence, the Númenorians turned against the Valar and sailed to conquer the Undying Lands, seeking eternal life by force. Ilúvatar himself intervened. Númenor was destroyed and swallowed by the sea. Its people drowned, and the world itself was reshaped so that Valinor was removed from mortal reach forever. Only a small group of Númenorians remained faithful to the Valar and the friendship of the elves. These were led by Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, who fled the downfall and established new kingdoms in Middle-earth, Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. These survivors became known as the Dunedain, or Men of the West. Their descendants carried the wisdom and resilience of Númenor into the later ages, though their lifespans diminished over centuries. From these lines came Aragorn, a direct heir of Isildur, and the rightful king of Gondor in The Lord of the Rings. His return to the throne symbolized the restoration of the old Númenorian legacy, the uniting of the faithful men who had not been corrupted by pride. In contrast, the other men of Middle-earth, those not descended from Númenor, remained divided. Some served Sauron out of fear or deception, the Haradrim, Easterlings, and Variags among them, while others such as the Rohirrim, became allies of the free peoples. Across the ages, men inherited both the courage and weakness of their kind, capable of immense good, yet easily swayed by power and fear. Their mortality, though misunderstood, remained central to their identity, marking them as beings meant to shape history through choice, not eternal life. The Eagles. The great eagles of Middle-earth were among the most majestic and mysterious beings in Tolkien's world. Though they appeared as enormous birds, they were far more than natural creatures. In origin, they were Maiar, lesser divine spirits of the Ainur, who took the form of eagles to serve Manwë, the chief of the Valar and lord of the air. Because Manwë ruled over the winds and skies, the eagles acted as his eyes, messengers, and occasionally instruments of divine intervention within Arda. In the earliest mythology, the eagles served as a direct link between the Valar and the events of Middle-earth. When the eagles appeared, it often signified that Manwë himself had turned his attention to mortal affairs. They observed the struggles of elves and men, and at critical moments they acted in defense of justice and mercy. Their appearance was always rare, deliberate, and symbolic. They never served as beasts of burden or tools of convenience, but as representatives of higher will. The first of the great eagles was Thorondor, who was said to have wings that spanned 30 fathoms. He appeared in the First Age, aiding the elves in their wars against Morgoth. Thorondor rescued the wounded Fingon and Madros from Morgoth's captivity, and later took part in battles across Beleriand, striking fear into the hosts of evil. The eagles continued to act as protectors and heralds of divine oversight through all ages, appearing when the balance of the world was most threatened. By the time of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the eagles still retained this same mythic role, though in more limited form. In The Hobbit, they rescue Bilbo, Gandalf, and the dwarves from goblins and wargs in the Misty Mountains, carrying them to safety. This moment reflects their divine heritage. Their coming symbolizes providence, not coincidence. At the Battle of the Five Armies, the eagles return once more to turn the tide of battle, echoing their ancient role as agents of deliverance. In The Lord of the Rings, the eagles appear again at decisive points. Under the leadership of Gwaihir the Windlord, they aid Gandalf on multiple occasions, rescuing him from Orthanc after his imprisonment by Saruman, and later from the peak of Xiraxagil after his battle with the Balrog. During the final battle at the Black Gate of Mordor, the eagles descend once again, engaging the Nazgul and protecting the armies of the West as the ring is destroyed. They are, as always, a sign of divine intervention, the final assistance granted to the free peoples when hope is nearly lost. Because of their symbolic nature, the eagles were never mere creatures of flight or transport. Their purpose was not to carry mortals on errands, but to act as messengers and guardians of the Valar's will. This explains why they could not simply be used to carry the One Ring to Mordor. They were not servants to be commanded, nor would they risk the corruption of such a task. The eagles of Middle-earth embodied the idea of grace, aid that arrives unexpectedly but never without meaning. Each time they appeared, it was a moment when the divine touched the mortal world, reminding all races that Ilúvatar's design still governed the fate of Arda. The Balrogs. The Balrogs were among the most fearsome and ancient beings in Middle-earth. Like Sauron, they were Maiar, lesser spirits of the Ainur, who had been corrupted by Melkor, the first Dark Lord, during the earliest days of creation. In their original state, they were powerful spirits of fire who served the Valar, but under Melkor's influence, they became twisted into beings of terror and destruction, embodying flame, shadow, and ruin. When Melkor descended into Arda and began to establish his dominion, many of the Maiar were drawn to his power and joined his rebellion. These became the Balrogs, known in Quenya as the Valar Aukar, meaning demons of power. They served as his captains and enforcers during the long wars of the First Age, wielding fiery whips and swords that could melt steel. The sight of a Balrog on the battlefield signified the presence of Morgoth's direct will, for they were extensions of his own malice and strength. In the wars against the Elves and the Valar, The Balrogs were instrumental in many of Morgoth's victories. They slew countless warriors, destroyed strongholds, and struck down some of the greatest heroes of the age. When the hidden city of Gondolin fell, the Balrogs led the assault, burning and crushing all in their path. Their power was not merely physical. Their very presence inspired terror and despair. They were shrouded in both flame and shadow, a fusion of light and darkness that symbolized Morgoth's corruption of creation itself. At the end of the First Age, Morgoth was defeated and cast out of the world during the War of Wrath, and most of the Balrogs were destroyed or driven into hiding. Only a few survived, retreating into the deep places of the earth where they remained hidden for thousands of years. The most famous of these survivors would later emerge in the Third Age as the Balrog of Moria, known to the dwarves as Durin's Bane. This Balrog lay dormant beneath the misty mountains until the dwarves of Khazad-dûm delved too deeply into the roots of the world in their search for Mithril. Their mining awakened the creature, and it rose in fire and ruin, slaying King Durin VI and his son Nine. Terrified, the dwarves fled, and their great kingdom became a haunted ruin. Centuries later, when the Fellowship of the Ring entered Moria, the Balrog confronted Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. The confrontation between the two was one of the last recorded battles between divine beings in Middle-earth. Both Gandalf and the Balrog were Maiar, though of opposing loyalties. Their duel represented a clash of ancient powers dating back to the creation of Arda itself. Gandalf broke the bridge and cast the Balrog down into the abyss, but was himself dragged into the depths. After pursuing and fighting the creature through the tunnels and mountains beneath Moria, Gandalf finally defeated it on the peak of Zirak-Zigil. This act cost him his mortal form, but his spirit was sent back to Middle-earth by the Valar to complete his mission, returning as Gandalf the White. The Balrogs stand as one of Tolkien's clearest depictions of corrupted divinity. Once beings of light, they became instruments of pure domination. Unlike dragons or orcs, they were not created by Morgoth, but seduced from their original purpose, showing that even the most powerful spirits could fall. Their presence throughout Tolkien's mythology links the ancient wars of the Valar with the later struggles of Middle-earth, serving as a reminder that the shadow of Morgoth never fully vanished. It only retreated into the deep, waiting to be awakened again. The Dwarves. The Dwarves were among the most distinctive races in Middle-earth, both in origin and in character. Unlike elves and men, who were created directly by Ilúvatar, the Dwarves were made by Aule, one of the Valar and the master of craftsmanship, smithing, and the earth's materials. Aule desired to teach and share his love of creation, so he shaped the dwarves secretly before the time appointed for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar. However, he did not have the authority to grant them true life. When Ilúvatar discovered what Aule had done, he confronted him. But seeing that Aule had acted out of love and not pride, Ilúvatar chose to bless the dwarves instead of destroying them. He granted them independent existence, saying that though they were not his first children, they would live and have their own place in the world after the elves had awoken. For this reason, the dwarves are sometimes called the adopted children of Ilúvatar. The first dwarves were known as the Seven Fathers of the Dwarves, created deep beneath the mountains of Middle-earth. Each of the Seven Fathers would go on to found one of the great dwarven clans, such as the Longbeards, Durin's folk, Firebeards, and Broadbeams. The Longbeards were the most renowned of all, descending from Durin the Deathless, the eldest of the Fathers, who awoke in Mount Gundabad. Dwarves built their great underground cities, Khazad-dûm, Moria, Nogrod, and Belegost, and became master craftsmen of stone, metal, and jewel work. Their craftsmanship was unmatched by any other race, save perhaps the Noldorin elves, and their works were prized throughout Middle-earth. In Tolkien's earliest writings, dwarves were portrayed far less favorably. In the early mythology, they were greedy, crude, and often allied with evil forces, even serving Morgoth. But this view changed dramatically as Tolkien developed The Hobbit and later integrated it into his larger legendarium. In The Hobbit, the dwarves, especially Thorin Oakenshield and his company, underwent a transformation from background characters to tragic heroes. They were no longer mindless hoarders of gold, but exiled craftsmen seeking to reclaim their homeland and the legacy of their fathers. This shift began when Thorin sang his lament for the lost kingdom under the mountain, describing the beauty of the dwarves' creations, their gold, gems, and craftsmanship not as symbols of greed, but of devotion to their ancestors' artistry. Through Thorin, Tolkien redefined the dwarves as a people of pride, skill, and deep emotional ties to their history. Their flaw remained their obsession with wealth, what Tolkien called dragon sickness, but even that greed was rooted in reverence for their heritage rather than mere avarice. In The Lord of the Rings, the dwarves' role evolved further. They became one of the free peoples of Middle-earth, standing alongside elves and men in opposition to Sauron. Characters like Gimli, son of Glóin, exemplified this new portrayal. Gimli's friendship with Legolas marked the first reconciliation between elves and dwarves after ages of mistrust, showing their capacity for loyalty and honor beyond old enmities. The dwarves of Erebor and the Iron Hills also provided vital resistance to Sauron's forces in the north during the War of the Ring. The origins of the dwarves remained a mystery even to other races, and Tolkien intentionally preserved that ambiguity within his lore. While the elves believed that only Ilúvatar could create true life, the dwarves maintained that Aul's craftsmanship gave them a special connection to the earth. Their resilience, independence, and endurance reflected that connection. They were born of stone and would not be easily broken. They did not fear the darkness underground or the weight of mountains above them. They were at home in the deep and the hard places of the world. Thus, the dwarves bridged the divine and the mortal. Created by a god, yet shaped by their own will, they embodied stubbornness, artistry, and survival. Their history, from the making of their race by Auli to Thorin's redemption and Gimli's heroism, illustrates Tolkien's theme of imperfection refined through struggle. A people not meant to be perfect, but steadfast, enduring, and fiercely loyal to the works of their own hands. The Orcs. The Orcs were the primary soldiers of evil in Middle-earth, vicious, numerous, and bred for war. They filled the armies of both Morgoth and Sauron, fighting wherever darkness spread. Yet their true origin was one of Tolkien's most complex and troubling ideas. Orcs were not simply created out of nothing. According to Tolkien's later writings, Morgoth could not give independent life to any being, for only Ilúvatar possessed the power to create sentient life. This limitation forced Morgoth to corrupt, not create, and so the orcs were twisted forms of other beings that once were good. In the earliest version of Tolkien's mythology, orcs were thought to be artificial creatures, forged by Morgoth in mockery of elves and men, living weapons without souls. But this view later changed. To maintain the theological integrity of his world, Tolkien concluded that Morgoth could not create true consciousness. Therefore, the orcs must have originated as elves captured, tortured, and corrupted in the earliest ages of the world. Through this process, Morgoth warped their bodies and spirits until they became permanently enslaved to hatred and cruelty. This made the orcs living blasphemies, perversions of the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, bound to evil by design. Over time, the corruption spread and multiplied. New generations of orcs were bred through cruelty and domination, becoming the vast armies that filled Morgoth's fortresses in the First Age and later Sauron's strongholds in the Second and Third Ages. Though they were capable of speech, fear, and even humor, their minds were twisted by the will of their masters. Morgoth poured part of his own malice into them, giving them a kind of dark will that bound them to service. They could act independently in small ways, but were ultimately driven by domination and hatred. In The Hobbit, Tolkien first called them goblins, drawing from fairy tale language. These goblins, who inhabited the Misty Mountains, were inventive in a crude way, making cruel tools and weapons, and dwelling in vast tunnel networks beneath the earth. By the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien began using the word orc almost exclusively, drawing from his own elvish languages, where orc meant demon. The two terms referred to the same race, though the orcs of Mordor were larger and stronger than the mountain tribes. One of the most significant variations among orcs was the Uruk-hai, introduced in The Lord of the Rings. These were a new breed of orcs, taller, hardier, and able to endure sunlight. They were bred by Saruman, who sought to create a stronger, more disciplined army for his own rebellion. Tolkien hints that the Uruk-hai may have been crossbred from men and orcs, a grotesque combination that symbolized ultimate corruption, merging the physical strength of men with the depravity of orcs. Though the process was never fully described, it emphasized the moral horror of Saruman's experiments and his descent into Morgoth's legacy of perversion. Orcs existed in many forms: the smaller, wiry goblins of the Misty Mountains, the black-skinned, iron-armored soldiers of Mordor, and the powerful Uruks of Isengard. Despite these differences, all orcs shared common traits: hatred for light, loyalty through fear, and a near-instinctive attraction to violence. They could speak in rough tongues derived from Elvish or the black speech of Mordor, but their language was coarse and unstable, reflecting their chaotic minds. The existence of the orcs raises one of the deepest moral questions in Tolkien's world. If they were corrupted elves, could they be redeemed? Tolkien himself never fully resolved this. He suggested that their corruption was so absolute that their spirits had been permanently twisted, bound to malice, until the end of Arda. Whether they retained any trace of their original elvish souls remains uncertain. In the wars of the later ages, the orcs became the faceless hordes of evil, embodiments of industrialized cruelty and dehumanization. They represented the idea of life stripped of beauty, creativity, and free will, creatures existing only to destroy. Their presence throughout Tolkien's mythology reminds readers that evil in his world was not creative, only corruptive. Where the Valar made in harmony, Morgoth and Sauron unmade, twisting the good into the grotesque. The orcs were the lasting mark of that corruption, proof that evil cannot truly create, only ruin what was once pure. The dragons. Dragons were among the most destructive and awe-inspiring creatures in Tolkien's legendarium, brought into being during the Wars of the First Age by Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Unlike orcs, which were corrupted from existing life, dragons were entirely of Morgoth's own design, living weapons created to shift the balance of power in his struggle against the elves and the Valar. They embodied his mastery of fire, destruction, and cunning, serving both as engines of devastation and symbols of his greed and pride. The first of all dragons was Glaurung, known as the Father of Dragons. He appeared during the First Age, initially as a great serpent without wings. Glaurung was more than a brute force of fire and strength. He was intelligent, manipulative, and cruel. He possessed both physical might and a terrifying mental power, the ability to dominate and deceive through his will alone. Glaurung's emergence changed the course of the wars in Beleriand. When he first attacked the elves, he devastated their armies with fire and fear, before being wounded and driven back. In later ages, he returned far stronger, leading Morgoth's hosts in the destruction of Nargothrond and the downfall of many noble houses. His influence extended beyond the battlefield. He used deceit to ruin the lives of heroes, such as Turin Turambar, proving that his power lay as much in corruption as in flame. After Glaurung came the winged dragons, more terrible still. They appeared during the final battles of the First Age, particularly in the War of Wrath, when Morgoth unleashed them against the armies of the Valar. These dragons, capable of flight and breathing fire from the skies, nearly turned the tide of battle before they were defeated by the forces of the West. Their introduction marked Morgoth's last and most devastating attempt to dominate Arda through fear and destruction. By the later ages, dragons had become rare, surviving remnants of Morgoth's creations. Yet they continued to shape the history of Middle-earth long after their master's fall. The most famous of these later dragons was Smaug, the Golden, who appears in The Hobbit. Smaug was a descendant of the ancient fire dragons and shared their greed, intelligence, and vanity. His attack on the dwarven kingdom of Erebor destroyed their realm and scattered Durin's folk across the north. Like Glaurung before him, Smaug's true power lay not only in his physical might but in his cunning speech and psychological manipulation. He could detect weakness, exploit pride, and sow doubt, traits that made him more than a simple monster. His hoarding of treasure, particularly gold, became a defining feature of dragonkind in Tolkien's world, their insatiable lust for wealth reflecting Morgoth's own spiritual corruption of desire. Not all dragons breathed fire. Tolkien described distinctions between fire drakes and cold drakes, the latter being wingless dragons that relied purely on strength and ferocity. Both kinds were nearly immortal, resistant to ordinary weapons, and immensely destructive. Yet despite their power, dragons were solitary. They served no master after Morgoth's defeat, living only for their own greed. This made them unpredictable forces of chaos, embodying the lingering malice of Morgoth's influence in the world. In Tolkien's mythology, dragons represent a fusion of intellect and ruin, a mind sharpened by malice and desire. Their greed corrodes everything around them, turning beauty into desolation. Unlike orcs or trolls, which serve through fear or enslavement, dragons are self-driven, seeking domination purely for their own satisfaction. Smaug's death at the hands of Bard the Bowman signaled not the end of their kind, but the diminishing of their influence, as the great beasts of Morgoth's design slowly faded from the world. Dragons are thus the physical manifestation of pride and greed, themes that echo throughout Tolkien's work. They destroy through consumption and possession, mirroring the downfall of beings who seek to own what cannot truly belong to them. In every age, they serve as reminders that the corruption of the heart can be as deadly as the destruction of the body. The werewolves and wargs. Among the many monstrous creations of Morgoth's dominion were the werewolves, terrifying beasts that blended spirit and flesh. Unlike the werewolves of European legend, humans who transformed under a curse or moonlight, Tolkien's werewolves were entirely different. They were not shapeshifters, but deliberately engineered creatures, massive wolves inhabited by corrupted spirits. Morgoth created them in the First Age as part of his dark experiments in combining living flesh with spiritual malice, effectively turning them into intelligent, bloodthirsty instruments of terror. The first and greatest of these werewolves was Draugluin, known as the father of werewolves. He served directly under Sauron, who at that time was Morgoth's chief lieutenant and master of sorcery. Draugluin's pack guarded Tol Gaurhoth, the Isle of Werewolves, a fortress where Sauron conducted his cruel enchantments. These creatures were more than beasts. They were infused with conscious hatred, capable of understanding orders and following their master's commands. Their most infamous act came when they captured Beren and Finrod Felagund, killing Finrod in battle before being destroyed themselves by Luthien and Huan, the Hound of Valinor. Draugluin was slain in that confrontation, and from his carcass, Sauron's servant Carcharoth, the greatest wolf ever made, was bred. Carcharoth, called the Red Maw, embodied the pinnacle of Morgoth's corruption. He was vast, cunning, and filled with unrelenting rage. When he devoured Beren's hand, along with the Silmaril it held, the holy light within the jewel burned him from the inside, driving him mad. In his frenzy, he rampaged through Morgoth's own lands, a symbol of how evil ultimately consumes itself. These werewolves were spiritual abominations, mire spirits of lesser rank than Sauron or Balrogs, imprisoned in wolf bodies to serve as Morgoth's hunting beasts. As ages passed and Morgoth fell, his werewolves vanished from the world, leaving behind echoes of their kind. By the Third Age, what remained of their legacy appeared as the wargs. Unlike the supernatural werewolves of the First Age, wargs were mortal creatures, giant wolves of great intelligence, cruelty, and malice. They dwelt mainly in the Misty Mountains and the wild lands around Mirkwood, often forming alliances with the Orcs. In The Hobbit, they appear as allies of the goblins, hunting Bilbo and the dwarves through the pine forests, until the great eagles rescued them. The wargs of that era could speak their own language, suggesting they retained some measure of unnatural cunning inherited from the dark enchantments of Morgoth's earlier wolves. Wargs were neither simple animals nor true spirits. They occupied an uncanny space between the two. They were intelligent enough to plan ambushes, coordinate attacks, and even form crude societies with orc tribes. However, they lacked the immortal or spiritual essence of the original werewolves, marking the decline of Morgoth's creations as the ages progressed. Where the werewolves of old were infused with dark sorcery, the wargs were living descendants, feral remnants of a once far greater evil. Through both werewolves and wargs, Tolkien illustrated the gradual fading of evil's power over time. The monstrous spiritual creations of the First Age gave way to mere beasts of malice in the Third. Yet the symbolism remained constant. Wolves in Tolkien's world always represented destruction unleashed by corrupted will, creatures that hunt not for sustenance, but for domination and bloodlust. In them, the echo of Morgoth's first dark experiments still prowled the edges of Middle-earth. The Hobbits. The Hobbits were the most unexpected race in all of Middle-earth. Small, peace-loving people who lived in rural comfort, far removed from the great wars and sorrows that shaped the world's history. Unlike elves, dwarves, or men, they were not part of Tolkien's earliest mythology at all. They entered the legendarium much later, beginning as a simple idea that grew into one of the most defining elements of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien first conceived of the Hobbits almost by accident. While grading student papers, he found a blank page and wrote the line, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." He had no idea what a hobbit was. The story that followed became his exploration of that very question. From this single line, Tolkien developed a culture of small folk, rural, cheerful, practical, and largely uninterested in the wider world. They lived in the Shire, a peaceful land of hills, farms, and quiet villages, inspired heavily by the English countryside of Tolkien's youth. In Middle-earth's lore, hobbits are a branch of the human race. They are considered a subspecies of men, having diverged long ago. Their size, roughly half that of an average human, combined with their long lives, keen eyesight, and stealthy movements, made them uniquely suited for survival in a quiet, agrarian existence. They were also remarkably resistant to domination and despair, qualities that would later make them central to the War of the Ring. Hobbit society revolved around comfort, routine, and community. They avoided adventure and distrusted anything that took them beyond their fields or pantries. Their technology was simple but effective, relying on craftsmanship rather than industry. They had no need for kings or armies, governing themselves through family traditions and local councils. Their social structure emphasized modesty and contentment over ambition, a direct contrast to the greed of dwarves or the pride of men. Despite their isolation, hobbits had ancient divisions within their own people. There were three main types: Harfoots, Stoors, and Falahides. The Harfoots were the most numerous and traditional, preferring hillsides and burrows. The Stoors were stockier and often lived near water, resembling the ancestors of Gollum's people. The Falahides were fairer and more adventurous, often taking on leadership roles. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins descended from this group. These distinctions explained the variety among hobbits, though by the time of The Lord of the Rings, their differences had largely blended within the Shire. Hobbits entered the broader history of Middle-earth almost by accident. Bilbo Baggins' encounter with the One Ring in The Hobbit set into motion the events that would define the Third Age. His finding of the ring, originally the lost treasure of Sauron, was not fate in the mortal sense, but part of the larger design of Ilúvatar, whose will often worked through the smallest and most unlikely of agents. When Frodo inherited the ring, the humble resilience of the hobbits was tested against the greatest evil in the world, proving that courage did not belong only to the great or the mighty. Tolkien intentionally left the deeper origins of hobbits obscure. They appeared quietly in the records of Middle-earth, living in the shadows of greater histories, yet their cultural traits, love of home, food, and peace, made them the moral center of Tolkien's world. Where elves represented beauty and men embodied ambition, hobbits stood for humility and endurance. Their strength was not physical but spiritual, a resistance to corruption, a refusal to despair, and a belief in the goodness of simple things. By the end of The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits' role had expanded far beyond their small corner of the Shire. Through Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, they demonstrated that ordinary lives could carry extraordinary weight in shaping the fate of the world. They were not warriors or kings, yet they achieved what none of the great powers could. By resisting domination, they conquered it. Tolkien described them as the ordinary courage of the quiet-hearted, and in that, the hobbits became his truest expression of heroism, strength rooted in simplicity, faith, and the will to do what is right even when no one is watching. The Trolls. Trolls were among the darkest and most grotesque creatures in Middle-earth, beings of immense strength and limited intellect. They were creations of Morgoth, made during the First Age as imitations of the Ents, just as orcs were corrupted versions of elves. In Tolkien's mythology, trolls were never truly natural beings. They were constructs, stone animated by sorcery and malice. Because Morgoth could not give true life, his creations were merely mockeries of Ilúvatar's work, reflections of power without spirit. For that reason, trolls were creatures of shadow and substance, dependent upon darkness for their existence. In The Hobbit, trolls appear for the first time in Tolkien's writings as brutish, comical villains. The three encountered by Bilbo, Tom, Bert, and William are large, dim-witted creatures who capture the dwarves and plan to cook them. They speak in coarse, Cockney-like dialects, showing that Tolkien initially used them for humor as much as for danger. Yet even in this early depiction, one of their defining traits is revealed. When exposed to sunlight, they turn instantly to stone. This was not mere folklore, but a reflection of their unnatural creation. Because they were made of stone to begin with, Morgoth's magic could not endure the touch of light, and the truth of their lifeless nature was revealed under the sun. As Tolkien's legendarium matured, the nature of trolls became darker and more complex. In the Silmarillion, they are described as creatures of dull and clumsy malice, bred by Morgoth in mockery of the Ents. They were strong enough to crush stone and wield immense weapons, but had little reasoning power and no real free will. Their strength made them devastating in battle, especially in the underground wars of the First Age, yet they remained slaves to the will that made them. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, trolls had evolved into several distinct kinds, reflecting Sauron's attempts to refine his master's design. The earliest type, the stone trolls, were still bound by the sun's curse, petrifying if exposed to daylight. Later, Sauron's craft produced new breeds that could withstand sunlight. These were the Olog-hai, or black trolls, who appeared during the War of the Ring. The Olog-hai were taller, crueler, and far more disciplined than their primitive ancestors. They understood speech, wore armor, and fought in organized ranks, particularly in the armies of Mordor. Yet even they were not truly alive in the sense that elves, men, or dwarves were. Their wills remained enslaved to Sauron's domination. Trolls appeared in various forms throughout the ages: hill trolls, cave trolls, mountain trolls, and snow trolls among them. Each adapted to its environment but shared the same essential nature: raw strength without wisdom. One of the most notable encounters with them occurs in Moria, when the Fellowship of the Ring faces a cave troll while defending Balin's tomb. The creature's enormous power and resistance to ordinary weapons illustrate the physical danger trolls posed, even as their lack of strategy made them vulnerable. The relationship between trolls and Ents revealed Tolkien's moral symmetry in creation. Ents were beings of life, guardians of the forests awakened by elvish song. Trolls were their dark reflection, lifeless, speechless, without command, and destructive by instinct. The Ents were born of Yavanna's blessing to protect the growing things of the world, while the trolls were Morgoth's mockery of that gift, made to break and crush. Ultimately, trolls symbolized the futility of evil's imitation of good. They were powerful but hollow, fierce but bound. When exposed to light, literal or moral, they reverted to what they had always been, dead stone. In Tolkien's mythic structure, that detail carried deep meaning. It showed that the creations of darkness could never truly endure in a world governed by Ilúvatar's light. Trolls might rage in the night, but with dawn, they return to lifelessness, reminders that evil cannot create. It can only counterfeit life until the truth burns through. The Ents. The Ents were ancient, sentient, tree-like beings, among the oldest living creatures in Middle-earth. They were created through the intervention of Yavanna, the Valar responsible for all growing things. In Tolkien's mythology, the Ents were conceived as a response to the destructive potential of Auli's creations. When Yavanna learned that Auli had made the dwarves, craftsmen who would dig and cut the earth, she feared for her forests. She went to Ilúvatar and asked that the trees be given protectors, guardians who could think, move, and defend the growing things of Arda. Ilúvatar granted her request, awakening the spirits that would become the Ents. Thus, they were not mere plants given mobility, but conscious beings, placed in the world to act as shepherds of the forests. In form, Ents resembled the trees they tended, tall, strong, and ancient. Each Ent took on characteristics of the forest where it lived. Some were oak-like and sturdy, others willowy and flexible. They could speak, think, and move deliberately, though very slowly by human standards. Ents were deliberate in all things, slow to anger, slow to act, but unstoppable once roused. Their deep voices, described as like the sound of earth and wood, reflected their connection to the natural world. The oldest and most prominent of them was Treebeard, also known as Fangorn, who lived in the forest bearing his name. He was said to be the oldest living being in Middle-earth at the time of the Lord of the Rings, older even than many of the elves. Treebeard remembered the earliest days of the world and spoke of times before the coming of men, or even the awakening of elves. He and his kin had been taught language long ago by the elves, who awakened the Ents' awareness and gave names to all things that grew. In the early conception of Tolkien's mythology, the Ents were not present. The idea of talking, mobile trees first appeared when Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings. Originally, he intended to include giants, large, human-like beings, but during the writing of the chapter that became Treebeard, he transformed that idea into something new, intelligent trees who spoke with the voices of the forest. From this inspiration emerged not just Treebeard himself, but the entire ancient race of Ents, rooted in the oldest natural forces of Middle-earth. The Ents' role reached its peak during the War of the Ring, when Treebeard and the other Ents of Fangorn rose against Saruman. For centuries, they had remained apart from the affairs of the world, tending their trees in silence. But Saruman's industrial assault on Fangorn, his felling of trees to fuel the forges of Isengard, awakened their wrath. At Treebeard's call, the Ents marched upon Isengard in what became known as the Last March of the Ents. They tore down the walls, flooded Saruman's stronghold, and destroyed his engines of war. It was one of the most powerful demonstrations of nature's retaliation against corruption and greed. Closely related to the Ents were the Huorns, a mysterious and darker class of beings. Huorns were trees that had begun to awaken but were not fully conscious like the Ents. Some moved only slightly or spoke in whispers, while others walked at night and acted with independent will. They were said to be both trees and not trees, restless, silent presences that could destroy intruders who harmed the forest. During the Battle of Helm's Deep, the Huorns appeared suddenly and annihilated the retreating army of orcs sent by Saruman, demonstrating that nature itself still harbored forces capable of judgment and retribution. Over the ages, the Ents dwindled in number. Treebeard spoke of the Entwives, their female counterparts, who had once loved gardens and ordered fields rather than wild forests. They had departed long ago, crossing the Anduin River to cultivate lands of their own. When those lands were destroyed in the wars of the Second Age, the Entwives disappeared, and the Ents never found them again. Their loss became a symbol of the fading of the old natural world, the separation of the wild and the cultivated, of forest and garden. The Ents represented the living will of the earth. They were the voice of nature given thought and purpose, embodying Tolkien's belief that creation itself possessed a sacred life deserving of protection. Where the trolls were Morgoth's crude parody, lifeless stone animated by darkness, the Ents were Ilúvatar's true creation, infused with patience, memory, and wisdom. Slow and ancient, they acted only when provoked beyond endurance, but when they moved, they changed the world. The spiders. The giant spiders of Middle-earth were ancient, malevolent creatures that traced their lineage back to the earliest ages of creation. At the root of their dark heritage was Ungoliant, one of the most terrifying beings in Tolkien's mythology. Ungoliant was not an animal, but a primordial spirit of darkness, possibly one of the lesser Ainur who had turned from the light of Ilúvatar before the making of the world. She took the form of a monstrous spider and devoured both light and life wherever she went. Her hunger was boundless, and her power immense, so much so that even Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, feared her once her strength grew beyond his control. Ungoliant's most infamous act occurred in Valinor, during the height of the First Age. At Morgoth's request, she aided him in his rebellion against the Valar by spinning a web of impenetrable darkness that smothered all light. Together, they destroyed the two trees of Valinor, the sacred sources of illumination for the world, plunging it into night. Ungoliant then betrayed Morgoth, demanding all the jewels he had stolen from the Valar, including the Silmarils. When he refused, she attacked him, and only the intervention of his Balrogs saved him from being consumed. After this, Ungoliant fled south into the lands of Middle-earth, where she spawned countless offspring before disappearing into the void, consumed at last by her own insatiable hunger. Among her descendants were the great spiders that infested the dark forests of later ages. The most significant of these was Shelob, who dwelt in the mountains bordering Mordor. She was not Morgoth's servant nor truly Sauron's, though she lived under his shadow. Shelob represented a lingering remnant of the world's ancient corruption, a being of pure appetite, existing only to devour and endure. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, she had become so vast and ancient that few living things could stand against her. Her lair in Cirith Ungol, a high pass leading into Mordor, was filled with webs, bones, and the darkness that flowed from her body like a miasma. When Frodo and Sam encountered Shelob, they faced not simply a beast, but an echo of the darkness from before the shaping of the world. Her hunger was not for sustenance, but for domination and fear. Tolkien described her as a creature of pure malice, one that fed on light itself. Her web was a physical manifestation of Morgoth's corruption, binding, smothering, and inescapable. Even Sauron, though far more powerful, allowed her to remain because she guarded the western approach to Mordor and preyed on any who dared to enter. In The Hobbit, Tolkien introduced a colony of giant spiders dwelling in Mirkwood, a forest long tainted by the shadow of Dol Guldur. These spiders were descendants of Shelob's kind, smaller but still intelligent and wicked. They spoke in cruel, taunting voices and hunted the forest's inhabitants, including the Wood Elves. Their presence showed how the corruption of Ungoliant's line had spread across Middle-earth, infecting once living forests with terror and decay. The spiders symbolized the most ancient and selfish form of evil in Tolkien's world, the hunger to consume without purpose. Unlike Sauron, who sought order and dominion, the spiders represented chaos and isolation, devouring everything until nothing remained. Their darkness was not merely the absence of light, but the willful rejection of it. In this way, Ungoliant and her brood embodied the void itself, the anti-creation, the consuming nothingness that existed before Ilúvatar's music gave the world form. Though Shelob was eventually wounded by Samwise Gamgee and driven away, she was not destroyed. Tolkien made clear that such beings did not truly die. They lingered until the world's end, feeding on decay. Through them, The presence of the ancient night persisted into later ages, a reminder that the shadow Morgoth unleashed could never be fully undone. The spiders of Middle-earth thus served as living remnants of the world's first rebellion, creatures that thrived in the ruins left behind by pride, greed, and corruption. Sauron and the Ringwraiths. Sauron was one of the most enduring and complex embodiments of evil in Middle-earth's history. Long before he became the Dark Lord of the Third Age, he was a Maya, a lesser spirit of the Ainur who originally served Aule, the Vala of craftsmanship and creation. In his earliest form, Sauron was not wicked, but driven by a desire for order, precision, and control. It was this very desire that led to his downfall. During the First Age, he was seduced by Morgoth, who offered him power and purpose in exchange for obedience. Under Morgoth's influence, Sauron's instinct for structure twisted into tyranny. His longing for order became domination, and his mastery of craft became a tool for enslavement. After Morgoth's defeat at the end of the First Age, Sauron went into hiding. When he eventually re-emerged in the Second Age, he sought to continue his master's work by dominating the free peoples of Middle-earth. Yet, unlike Morgoth, Sauron did not rely on brute force alone. He was a deceiver. Assuming a fair form and calling himself Anatar, meaning Lord of Gifts, he approached the Elves of Eregion and taught them the art of ring-making. Under his instruction, the elven smith Celebrimbor and his kin forged the Rings of Power, lesser rings meant to preserve beauty, heal, and strengthen the realms of Middle-earth. In secret, however, Sauron forged a master ring of his own in the fires of Mount Doom, the One Ring, pouring a great portion of his own spirit and will into it. His purpose was singular. Through this ring, he could dominate all others, binding their bearers to his will. When he put it on, the elves immediately perceived his betrayal and removed their rings. Enraged, Sauron launched a war against them, seizing the rings that remained and distributing them to other races to ensnare them through greed and ambition. To the dwarves, he gave 7 rings, which inflamed their lust for gold but could not dominate their wills. To men, he gave 9 rings, and it was these that brought about the Ringwraiths. The Ringwraiths, or Nazgul, were once mortal kings, sorcerers, and warlords of great renown. Through the power of their rings, Sauron granted them long life and strength, but at a terrible cost. Over time, their bodies faded, leaving only their wills, bound utterly to Sauron through the One Ring. They became invisible, existing halfway between the seen and unseen worlds, tormented and enslaved. Their existence was a form of undeath. They could not be killed by ordinary means, yet they had lost all independence and identity. Cloaked in black, crowned yet faceless, they became Sauron's most feared servants, enforcing his will with relentless pursuit. When Sauron was overthrown in the War of the Last Alliance, the great conflict that ended the Second Age, he was defeated by the combined armies of elves and men. Isildur, son of Elendil, cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, destroying his physical form. Yet because Sauron had bound a portion of his spirit to the ring, he could not die as long as it survived. His power became dormant, awaiting the ring's rediscovery. This act of self-binding ensured his immortality but also his vulnerability. The ring was both his might and his weakness. By the Third Age, Sauron had returned in a shadowy form, first as the necromancer of Dol Guldur, then as the formless ruler of Mordor. The Nazgul reappeared as his lieutenants, spreading fear across the lands. Their leader was the Witch King of Angmar, the most powerful of the 9, who waged centuries of war against the northern realms of men. The Nazgul had no physical strength of their own, but wielded terror as a weapon, their presence enough to shatter courage. When they pursued Frodo and the ring from the Shire to Rivendell, their cries marked the return of an ancient darkness to the world. Sauron's mastery of domination extended beyond the Nazgul. Through the One Ring, he sought to control all beings capable of will, imposing absolute order under his rule. To him, the ring represented the perfection of authority, a single power governing all others. Yet this vision, rooted in pride, was his undoing. The destruction of the ring at Mount Doom in the final days of the War of the Ring dissolved his being completely. His physical form disintegrated, and his spirit was cast into the void, never to rise again. Sauron's fall marked the end of the great spiritual evils that had shaped the world since its creation. His story was the last echo of Morgoth's rebellion, an attempt to impose total control over a creation meant for free will. The Ringwraiths, bound entirely to his power, perished with him. In Tolkien's moral framework, Sauron represented the corruption of intellect and craft, the will to dominate rather than to serve, to impose order by force instead of through harmony. His defeat restored balance to Middle-earth, but it also left behind a lasting truth, that the desire to rule others, even in the name of order, is the seed from which all tyranny. The ghosts, the dead men of Dunharrow. The ghosts of Middle-earth, most prominently known as the dead men of Dunharrow, were spirits cursed to linger in the world long after death. They were men of the White Mountains who had once sworn allegiance to Isildur, the king of Gondor and son of Elendil, during the War of the Last Alliance in the Second Age. When the time came to fulfill their oath and march against Sauron, they broke their promise, refusing to fight. Their betrayal was not born of cowardice alone, but of divided loyalty. They had once worshipped Sauron during his rise and could not easily turn against him. For this act of treachery, Isildur pronounced upon them a curse that no mortal king had ever uttered before. He declared that they would find no rest until they fulfilled their oath. From that moment, they became shadows, condemned to wander the caverns beneath the White Mountains, unseen by the living, but bound to their broken vow. Their land, once called the Paths of the Dead, became a place of dread, avoided by all living beings. Travelers who ventured near heard whispers and felt cold, oppressive fear, for the spirits of oath-breakers remained trapped there, neither alive nor wholly dead. The dead men of Dunharrow were not typical ghosts in Tolkien's mythology. They were bound spirits, anchored to Arda by divine judgment, rather than lingering through mere will or sorrow. In the cosmology of Middle-earth, death was meant to free the souls of men, allowing them to leave the world entirely. But those who defied oaths or committed great treachery could be denied that release, forced to remain until justice or redemption was achieved. Thus, the dead men were not evil like the Ringwraiths, nor demonic like Morgoth's corrupted spirits. They were penitent shades trapped by the weight of their broken word. For centuries, their curse endured. Kingdoms rose and fell, and still they haunted the mountains, waiting for a chance to atone. Their redemption came in the War of the Ring, when Aragorn, heir of Isildur, summoned them through ancient rite. Accompanied by Legolas and Gimli, he entered the Paths of the Dead, a network of tunnels beneath the mountains leading to the Stone of Eric, the ancient site of the Oath. There he confronted the spectral host and demanded that they fulfill their promise to fight Sauron's forces. Recognizing him as the rightful heir of the king who had cursed them, the dead men obeyed, emerging from their shadows to ride once more to war. The army of the dead swept across the southern lands of Gondor, unseen and unstoppable, striking terror into Sauron's servants. Their arrival turned the tide of battle, breaking the corsairs of Umbar and securing victory for Aragorn's forces. Once their ancient oath was finally fulfilled, Aragorn released them from their curse, saying, "Be at peace." With those words, their forms faded, and their spirits were freed at last to depart the world. The tale of the dead men carried a moral weight that echoed throughout Tolkien's mythology. Oaths were sacred, binding not just in life but in eternity. To swear falsely or to break one's word was to disrupt the moral order of creation itself. This theme appeared elsewhere in Middle-earth's history. The tragedy of Feanor and his sons, bound by the oath of the Silmarils, demonstrated that oaths could both empower and destroy. In the case of the dead men, the broken promise led not to worldly ruin, but to spiritual imprisonment, lasting until justice was restored. The Ghosts of Dunharrow also revealed Tolkien's belief that true redemption required action. The dead could not simply regret their failure, They had to fulfill their oath indeed. Only then could they escape their torment. Their release under Aragorn's command represented both a literal and symbolic cleansing of ancient guilt, a restoration of honor through obedience to rightful authority. Beyond the dead men of Dunharrow, Middle-earth contained other restless spirits as well. The Barrow-wights of the Barrow Downs were ancient malevolent ghosts, raised by dark sorcery to inhabit burial mounds and ensnare travelers. Unlike the dead men, these were not penitent souls, but corrupted remnants, enslaved by the Witch King of Angmar. Their existence reflected the darker side of undeath, spirits twisted into instruments of terror. The contrast between the Barrow-wights and the dead men illustrated Tolkien's distinction between corruption and redemption. Both were trapped beyond death, but only one could find peace through fulfillment of duty. In the end, the story of the dead men of Dunharrow brought Tolkien's vision of moral order full circle. Even death could not erase the consequences of broken promises, but through courage, obedience, and faith, redemption remained possible. Their fading after fulfilling the oath marked the closing of one of Middle-earth's oldest wounds, proving that while evil may linger in the world, so too can justice endure until every debt is paid.